For this week's classic interview, we're going to revisit my discussion with Claire Connor, who talked to us about how individuals can and often do escape their family's extremism. And this is a particularly relevant concept right now with the coalescing, catalyzing, and fomenting of really horrible extremism, record number of hate incidents under President Donald Trump, and this discussion over how much is Trump directly fomenting that and how much is happening by virtue of the sort of cult of personality that his supporters have created around him. The discussion with Claire Connor, never more relevant, at least during the time of the David Pakman Show's existence, than it is today. We will go to my interview with her from nearly 6 years ago and think about it as I reviewed it over the weekend, thinking about it in the context of the Trump presidency and the coalescing and fomenting of extremism that we've been tracking now for more than 2 years. Today, Claire Connor is with us. Her new book, Wrapped in the Flag, is her story of being raised by extremist parents in a household that embraced the John Birch Society and the radical right. She was able to escape and lead her life as a progressive. Claire, it's so great to talk to you. And I'm on this program, we do a lot with extremism, and many times we talk to extremists. Just last week, we had a white separatist, self-described, and talked with him about his goals and his ideas and kind of where his beliefs came from. You have a very different situation, which is that your parents were two of the first Chicago members of the John Birch Society, and you were in a situation where the upbringing clearly should have led you maybe to be a right-winger, but that's not how it ended up. So let's start first with kind of your upbringing and what that was like.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, David. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk to you and to your audience. First thing I think people need to understand is the John Birch Society in the 1960s was the best funded, most successful, and most powerful right-wing populist organization that the United States had ever seen. We'd had populist right-wing movements before, but in this particular case, the founder of the John Birch Society, a fellow named Robert Welsh, actually figured out how to get all of the membership working on the same thing at the same time. And he used a very monolithic approach. So what he said is what the John Birch Society did. This is not an organization that embraced the concept of democracy, either within itself or for the country at large. My father was the first member of the John Birch Society in the city of Chicago, and my mother was the second. They believed so much in the cause that in 1959, they wrote a check to the John Birch Society for $2,000 for 2 life memberships. That would be like you, David, writing a check for $12,500 today for membership. They were true believers. My father became a member of the National Council in 1960 just after the National Council, which is an advisory group to Robert Welsh, just after it was founded. So interestingly enough, he remained on the leadership for 32 years. This is not a man who changed his views, backtracked, or rethought his positions. He remained a true believer all of his life. And even after I left the Birch Society, he was constantly recruiting me back into the cause.
So as you were growing up, I mean, at what point did you, for a certain time, kids kind of don't know that there are really other options, right? It's just what your parents tell you. That's the status quo. It's your frame of reference, period. What was the catalyst that made you start to kind of reevaluate where you were politically?
Well, I think people think that there was like this moment when I leapt up and said, I'm not doing this anymore. Actually, the story is much more complex than that. And I think it's an object lesson for anybody who thinks about how people live in extremism. It takes a long time. I tell audiences it was like 1 step forward, 2 back, a half a step forward. I wanted very much to please my parents. I loved my father. I loved my mother. And they were very powerful, strong, and compelling people. So it took probably 25 years of reading and struggle before I was finally able to say, this is not my vision for America. I don't believe in what the John Birch Society is preaching. Now, the first step forward for me had to do with meeting a fellow named Revelo Oliver when I was 14 years old. Revelo Oliver was one of the John Birch Society leaders, like my dad. And once my father became a leader, a whole parade of Birchers went in and out of our life. Our home in Chicago was like the stopping point for Birch leadership. Revelo Oliver used to come over quite often, and he was a fellow who was very educated, a classics professor, but he had a profound impact on my parents because Revelo Oliver did not believe that there was a Holocaust during World War II.
Huh.
So suddenly, even though I'd been raised in a Jewish neighborhood and had learned about the Holocaust when I was a little girl, even before the word Holocaust was applied to the horrors in Germany, suddenly my father was saying, well, you know, the Germans were really just trying to stop the communists from taking over in Germany. I thought my father had lost his mind. And I was positive Revelo Oliver had helped him. Now, that may not sound of particular significance to people until you think about this. Dr. Revelo Oliver, if you Google him today, you'll find out that Revelo Oliver was the father of the neo-Nazi movement.
Right.
So when you talked to that white supremacist last week that you were sharing about, David, he would have been very knowledgeable about Revelo Oliver. Revelo Oliver has coined the term hollow hoax. And that term is used all across the anti-Semitic far right today. In addition, Revelo Oliver talked to Andrew Pierce, who was originally a Bircher. Andrew Pierce talked him into writing a novel about the white supremacist takeover of America. That novel is called The Turner Diaries. Now, interesting about the Turner Diaries, when the police stopped Timothy McVeigh about an hour after the Oklahoma City bombing, what did they find in his car but excerpts from the Turner Diaries?
Incredible, incredible.
Yeah.
You know, we only have a few minutes left, and there's a lot of other things I wanted to touch base with you on. So a few things I wanted to ask about. One was, before your parents passed away, ultimately, what was your relationship like with them, or how did it change as a result of your changed political views?
It was a very, very contentious relationship. I lived in the same town with my parents, so I had a lot of responsibility and concern toward the end of their lives and did everything I could to help them. But they were very, very angry. I think one of the keys to understanding the far right is they are angry. They are angry. They are angry at the government, and they're angry at people who don't agree with them. So my mother used to say, you are a disgrace to the country and to our family. But the most important thing that I want to share with people is I learned something from living in the radical right. I learned that extremism breaks families. It breaks families apart. It destroys relationships. It is full of a sort of paranoia and hate that's really bad for families. But more important than that, I don't want extremism to break my country. So that's why I wrote my book, to share the story of what it's like growing up in extremism, how I escaped, and why it matters to the United States today.
So how did you, now with your children, taking in what you learned and what you've experienced with the dynamic with your parents, how is the conversation about politics happening around your children? Because the case could be made that maybe they on their own might choose right-wing beliefs, and it could be just as wrong for you to push progressive beliefs onto them. I think that there would be diverging views about that, but how have you handled politics with your children?
Well, I was always pretty much policy wonk, David, because I was raised in a political family. I find politics very interesting. And for a very long time, my kids thought I was a Republican. Interesting, huh? So it was, what I wanted my children to understand is there's a difference between conservatives and extremists. There's a big difference. And extremist philosophies are dangerous to the governance of the United States. I think we actually need a viable second party. We need a GOP. We do. You can't have a one-party system that works at all well with our constitutional structures. But the point is that what's happened in the Republican Party today is that this radical right has taken it over. So you see John Boehner, you hear policy ideas prescribed by the leadership of the GOP, which sound exactly like what was prescribed by the John Birch Society way back when. So it's a repetition of the same sort of, we hate the government, we want to hobble the government, we want to dismantle the government. Long before Grover Norquist got the idea of drowning the government in the bathtub, the John Birch Society believed in that. So I think there's a big difference. At the same time, I also think that we have to be clear as progressives that we need to talk about how governance works and what America should look like. I do not believe it should look like anything imagined by the John Birch Society.
We've been speaking with Claire Connor. The new book is Wrapped in the Flag. Make sure to take a look at that book. Excellent read. Claire, thank you so much for being on with us today, and we will be back with plenty more right after this.